Hello and welcome to A Woman's Heart. I'm Lisa Granger. Is the modern lifestyle running you a little ragged? We'll take a deep breath and relax as we continue our summer reading series with this conversation with Brenda Yoder. She shares some of the principles in her latest book, Uncomplicated: Secret Skills for a Compelling Life, and they can lead to a more fulfilling and resilient life. Be sure to check out the show notes for how to connect with Brenda and for a link to get the complete summer reading list on my website, lisagranger.com. Without further ado, here's me and Brenda. Welcome to A Woman's Heart. We have a repeat guest, very special. We have Brenda Yoder here with us today, and I'm so looking forward to you joining us today, Brenda.
Thanks so much for having me on again, Lisa.
Oh, you are very welcome. Always welcome here. I love your wisdom, and you have a lot of that to share. But just in case someone has not heard your previous interview or they are not familiar with you, I would love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself and something fun that isn't normally in your bio.
Sure. So I'm Brenda Yoder. I come from Shipshewana, Indiana, where I work as a licensed mental health counselor, a part-time school counselor in a K-4 building. I'm a writer and speaker. My books are Uncomplicated: Simple Secrets for a Compelling Life, Pledge Launching Your Kids Without Losing Your Mind. And I'm a mom of 4 adult children, 3 wonderful little grandsons with one on the way. So that's new in our life. We have an Airbnb in our home. I was a former dairy farmer's wife. And something fun about me is that I have milked a water buffalo in India.
Oh my. That is definitely unusual. I don't think I've met anyone that has done that before.
No. So when I thought about, there are probably many stories that I can think of, but I think that's probably the most different one than what people would probably expect.
Yes. Well, I have had the privilege of going to India, but I did not milk any water buffaloes while I was there. I was busy doing kind of touristy things.
Yeah.
So, well, that is definitely a lot of fun and a unique thing. And you mentioned your new book, and you've written Pledge, which is a wonderful, good parenting. And you've written a lot of things about that. And Uncomplicated is a little different. It's certainly good for parents, but it's good for a lot of people. And I would love to hear what inspired you to write Uncomplicated.
Sure. Uncomplicated was inspired probably by 3 different events that I was kind of mulling over in my head for a while. One is that during in my counseling office, I started finding over the last few years that many people just really had a hard time having balanced thinking. Everything was either fatalistic or idealistic in kind of this common sense that we as humans have, and I think as Christians especially, we should have really started becoming almost like an aha moment when clients would be like, oh, I've kind of never thought about that there's an in-between, not this or that. So that was one. Another thing was during the pandemic, God kept calling my attention and my mind frame to nature. So it was almost like when everything else in the world had shut down, didn't know how to work, there were no working solutions. I sat out on my front porch and would watch God feed the bird. We have these bird feeders, and the birds would just come to the bird feeder. And we live in a farming area. My husband grew up as a farmer, and his brothers still farm. And I watched as spring planting went on as usual. I watched these natural rhythms, even including the sunrise and the sunset. It was almost as if God kept telling me every morning, don't worry, I am here every single morning, and at the end of the day, these things are consistent. It's just that we have become so wrapped up in the world and culture around us that we have forgotten how God reveals himself and even problem solving through nature. And then the third thing really was an Airbnb guest who left our home said, and this was also during the pandemic, but they left and they said, "You are so rich, I envy you." And I kind of laughed because I'm like, we live on public educator salaries. But what they were referring to was a way of life that people hunger for. And yet we just simply live out day in and day out. And it's not anything fancy. It's not anything that we've curated. It has just been living a little bit more sustainable life in a farming community in a small town. And that's when I really realized that kind of all of these things together had some value and meaning. And Uncomplicated was kind of the process of kind of putting it all together, of these sustainable principles that don't change over time, are embedded in God's word, are embedded in nature. Our grandparents knew what they were, and we just really need to reintroduce them to our modern culture.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And I mentioned earlier before that I made sure I read through it, but I want to go back and kind of savor a lot of the lessons in there. And I liked that you used, I would say, more vintage words, not even necessarily contemporary words, when you talked about the 10 lessons or skills or virtues that you talked about in the book. You used more traditional words that we don't necessarily talk about. I mean, who uses the word fidelity and prudence nowadays? We just don't necessarily use those words. And so I liked how you kind of pulled those back out as well. And you mentioned how needed that is today. And you've just kind of grown up this way, and this is how you've been living life that just kind of is what it is. And so what do you see as the need that people, have that this book can help with?
I think people are missing the modeling of a more grounded, sustainable, common sense, practical, not just lifestyle, but our own internal systems. And I think that's the difference. I think 20 years ago, we still saw these things being lived out. We still, when we were frenzied, we knew that when we came home from whatever was going on out there at work or at school or in the culture, we could come home and we felt at rest at home because there was no one else clamoring for our attention. There was no other voices. We had literally come home and no one bothered us because we were with our people who were safe and comfortable.
Yeah.
We can't do that anymore because social media and everything online follows us wherever we go. I think the other thing also is that just general discourse of basic human behaviors, like human behaviors that have been around all throughout time, they're becoming less and less visible to us. And we learn and we model what we see. Mm-hmm. And so when what we see or hear is more of the frenzy, more of the extreme type of emotions and behaviors and responses, then that's what our mind, what our eyes tend to gravitate towards. So Uncomplicated really is about showing and telling and bringing people back. And much of what's embedded in the book is thinking about who are the people in our life who have modeled these for us. Because even when someone has passed away, but we saw them modeled it in their life, we kind of forget about it unless we actively see it all the time. And I think also just in our social structures, we're not interacting with peers and with groups physically the way we used to. So what used to be general workplace culture, where you didn't do certain things at work, now is so different because the work culture has even changed. We can kind of do whatever we want to do behind a Zoom screen or just even, just ghosting, like not showing up. That used to not be something you did in the past. So Uncomplicated really is set and designed to put in front of us what we just simply need to see more of.
Yeah. And you mentioned like 20 years ago, and I immediately thought of my grandparents. I was very blessed that my grandparents lived a very long life. I had 3 grandparents into my 40s. And which is very unusual. They lived to be 92, 93, and 95. And I know 2 of them, on my mom's side, they had a big piece of land and they had a garden. And I have memories as a child of going over and making applesauce and freezing corn. And they had a horse for a number of years. And as you mentioned in the book, the cows had to be milked. It didn't matter what else was going on. The community would pitch in if something something happened or whatever, but the animals needed to be taken care of. There were certain things where you could grieve, but you had to keep going. You couldn't just curl up and go away. And that was definitely modeled to me by my grandparents. And you keep going. It's not that you bury your emotions, which one of the things I did appreciate in some of the chapters, I started to feel, I was like, oh my gosh, how can I really do this? But then you would balance it on the other side. This doesn't mean, if we're just being practical, that you never do anything whimsical or anything silly. Or, if you're being, steady, that doesn't mean you bury your emotions. You can still feel them. So I appreciated how you wouldn't try to shame us into not feeling.
Well, as a counselor, that's what I get paid for, is to help people know their feelings.
Yeah, that is true.
I think you're right, Lisa. I think for those of us, when we think about being practical, I think many of us were raised in, if we were raised in households where practicality really was a very valued virtue, we were probably taught that it wasn't practical to cry or to get upset or something. Don't cry over spilled milk was an adage probably for some of us. But I think that's where the pendulum has almost swung the other way, which is now every emotion is expressed. We express it however we want, but we also have forgotten, again, the practical life doing that really involves both of those things. And I think that's where hopefully this book really does give people kind of that plumb line to say, okay, so this really is about, I can be sad and teary, I can be struck with grief, or I can be really mad, but it doesn't have to disrupt my day. And even on the worst day, I still get up, I still go to work, and I still function.
Yeah, and you don't necessarily take it out on someone. You can say, I'm having a bad day, or I'm very angry about this, but you don't have to do it in a disrespectful, mean way. That's kind of that self-control that comes into play, is you can recognize that I'm really sad, I need a moment, or I'm very angry about this just really upset me, but still be able to, as you said, function, or maybe even express it, but express it in a more controlled, less damaging, hurtful way.
Yeah. And that's where I think one of the virtues, I think, is that old-timey name called forbearance and equanimity. And the reason I chose those over basic self-control or balance, because that's kind of what both of those entail. When you dive into forbearance and equanimity, it really is this calm, even-mindedness in difficult situations. And that's much richer, fuller, and it has more depth than just self-control. Yeah. We can be self-controlled, but not know how to handle or go forward in a situation. And interestingly enough, I believe it's the NIV version, the most recent that is listed on Bible Gateway, has replaced patience in Galatians 5:22 and 23 to be forbearance again.
Oh, okay. That is interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So I don't think I'm wrong. I could be wrong, but I kind of seems like I had just checked that verse recently for some edits I was doing, where they want me to always check my passages with Bible Gateway. And there it was. It was forbearance. It wasn't King James Version. It was the most updated version of the NIV.
Wow, that is interesting. Well, and I always like looking at different versions of the Bible when I look at verses to see the different words. And sometimes they're almost the same word every single time in every translation. And in sometimes it's very different, or it gets expanded in the Amplified. But I always find it interesting to see which word choices they use in certain verses when you're looking to give a fuller, richer idea of what the concept is in there. And you mentioned that, yes, you are a counselor, so you definitely are taught and are being paid to help people with their feelings. And how do you think your counseling training played into the book?
Yeah, I think it really helped in addressing so many of those situations that people go through in their life, and really just meeting people's needs.
Yeah.
I think that for a lot of people, we think that we have to have a certain type of lifestyle in order to have what we really desire, or that in order to have a more simple life or less complicated life, we have to get rid of stress, or we have to go out and buy 40 acres and become a homesteader. And that's just not accurate. I do also think that the working with very difficult situations such as domestic violence, foster care, abuse, has also helped me value the practical skills of coming home and putting your hands to something. In fact, I did a retreat on Uncomplicated a couple months ago. And one of the gals at the table, when we were talking about mental health, and we were talking about the importance of kind of these practical skills of putting your hands to something, whether it's knitting, whether it's baking, whether it's just planting a small garden, a flower garden outside, or a window box or something. She said, when my brother came back from the Gulf War, he had PTSD, and milking cows saved his life. And when she said that, it really validated what I have witnessed and experienced. And there's an example that I gave in the book of when I was working foster care and domestic violence one day, and I came home and we were milking goats at the time. And I had to come in and milk the goat. And there was something calming, but also problem solving. So our brains are designed to protect us and to solve problems.
Yeah.
And we as a culture have completely removed the practical, physical, and mental skill of problem solving. We have become so astute to going to Google or looking to social media or listening to advice for how to solve our problems that we have robbed our brain of the ability to actually try things. If it works out, good. If it doesn't work out, that's great. But then also just completing basic skills that teaches our brain, I do have the capacity to problem solve. So when I came home and milked the goat that day, this simple process of me relieving her heavy bag of milk that was feeding my family was a simple rhythm and process in our life that taught me that while there are complex problems that at times feel unsolvable, we as humans still have the ability to problem solve. And our brains and our minds and our physical bodies are designed together by God to live within our life and to figure things out. And I think that's one of the biggest things, is that a lot of the stories that I share are pretty much just, again, practical situations to say life's problems and the culture around us does not have to shipwreck us. We have the capacity to problem solve, to be resourceful, to figure things out. And I'm here to tell you, you can do it.
And I appreciated that. A lot of the stories that you brought up were very simple, everyday stories. And actually, the milking the goat was the first thing that I thought of when you started. I was like, oh, the goat, when she was milking the goat. And I know that it's interesting. I have 20-somethings for now, and they have commented on not everyone has the ability to problem solve and to think and try to come up with a solution. They know how to follow directions. They know how to do what they're told, but to try to look at a problem and come up with a solution and think independently outside of that, they just they don't know how to do that. They've never been taught. And trust me, my kids weren't always happy when we tried to instill that in them. Well, what do you think? Just tell me. I was like, no, what do you... But it is a skill that you have to practice that I think is sometimes lost today.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. And it's something as educators that my husband and I really have seen over the last few years. My husband was a high school math teacher, and we have seen the problem solving. It's a decline rapidly. The good thing is that while it's a skill, it's also a basic human skill. Again, God designed our brains to be problem solving, but my 20-somethings have mentioned the same thing about their peers. In fact, when I talk to my younger two, who are both Gen Zs, what things that they have found have been helpful growing up on the farm or in our environment that have helped them in adulting and in the real work world is that basic skill that you just mentioned, is that they know how to figure things out, because when you don't have every convenience on your corner, you have to figure something out. We don't, our shops here in our small town, they close up at 5 o'clock every day. We don't have a full-fledged local grocery store. You can't just, and we have Amish neighbors. They can't just Google things. You really have to sit and think. And often, sometimes I think through it from the computer aspect, right? So our young adults really do know how to solve things, but they know the right questions to ask. In order to do a Google search, that's the correct Google search, you have to know the right way to ask the question. It's really no different than in real life when we don't run to Google or to YouTube to give us the answer. Is if I were to problem solve this, what is the right question to ask? And I think the other thing that's really important is that the younger generations have lost the confidence to be able to take risks. So without Google or YouTube, all of humanity has tried something. If it doesn't work, then you try the next thing. And I think that's the one thing that I've learned on the farm that I did transfer into my private practice, which is cows have to be milked twice a day, every day. You don't have a choice if things break down. You have to figure it out. And so you try something immediate to make the immediate fix for the situation, and then you have to troubleshoot for the long term. And we just simply need to give ourselves and each other more confidence to say, God's created you with a really supercomputer brain, so don't be afraid to use it.
And one of the things that I enjoyed reading through it, you mentioned some of the lies that society and the world has told us, and we've kind of bought in to a lot of these lies that are counter to the 10 virtues that you mentioned in this book. And I would love for you to kind of dive into some of those lies that society and the world and the culture today has kind of fed us, that we've like, oh, okay, sure.
Yeah, I think one of them is that we don't have the ability to figure things out on our own when we really do. Another one is that a simple life or an uncomplicated life is somehow like a relaxing, laid-back life. And it simply is not. Yeah. I think that's the thing that I love to share with people, is that we think of life as being this, like a simple life, as being very minimalist and being very dreamy, Instagram real, right?
Yeah, and easy.
Right, and easy. Well, having raising your own food or having animals, it's anything but easy. You have to get up early, you have to be responsible. But life is hard. And really, we have lost this acceptance that here on this side of the earth, there is death, mourning, crying, and pain. Mm-hmm. But as Christians, we have the presence of the Holy Spirit inside of us, which gives us the virtues of patience, self-control, peace, love, all of those things that don't come natural. So I think that's another one. I think the other one is that we have to be somehow engaged in social media and engaged in the culture in order to be relevant, or to be admirable, or to have a compelling life. And I think that's the one thing that I really want people to think about are, who are the heroes in your life? And most of the heroes in our own lives, they're not Instagram influencers. They're not authors. They're not the people out in front. The people who we really admire most are the people we see doing life day in and day out. We see them walk through adversity, and they're the ones when we think of, who do I need to get courage from? And it's usually the quiet person at work, in our family, in our community, at school, who we see show up and do hard things every day, but they do it with such a demeanor that it invites us to want to be like that. And we've just really lost that bridge for how to have a compelling life without all the bells and whistles that everything today tells us we have to have.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's a lot of truth to that. And well, actually, when you said some of the people aren't, I was like, well, actually, I know, but I'm kind of in that world right now where I'm interviewing authors and speakers and writers and get to know some of them like you. And so I was like, well, no, I would say that some of them are, but that's because in getting to know, but that's getting to know more than just the writer or just the book. It's getting to know the person as well. But by and large, you're right. It's the people that are around us every day. And like the one person that comes to mind was a grocery store clerk who I was having a horrible, it was a very difficult season, and I was in a very bad mood at the grocery store, just kind of like putting my stuff up, trying not to take it out. I was like, how are you today? I'm like, I'm just gritting my teeth and going through it. And she was like, oh, well, let me pray for you right there. And I was like, well, okay. And really spoke to me, and I would actually pick her line next time I came back. And so it was, just an everyday occurrence, nothing grand or spectacular about it, but very meaningful. And some of the meaningful interactions that I've had that I've remembered, one person I only saw once, and I still remember the interaction. And so that is, you don't have to be, a big Instagram influencer with millions of followers, which I draw comfort from because I don't have millions of followers. Because then you get into the comparison game as far as that. Now, I love, I'm going to just go ahead and read all of we've touched on them. So I'm going to read all of the words that you mentioned in here in the book. It was contentment, resourcefulness, prudence, practicality, fidelity, forbearance, and equanimity, stewardship, interdependence, groundedness and humility, foresight, heritage, and legacy. So we would definitely, I hope so many people get out, and I think it's so needed for us to revisit that. I've often told people that I have no desire to go back to a time when I could not show a scandalous amount of my ankle. However, not everything was bad. There are these timeless traits that I would love for us to bring back that would lend balance and so much richness and much needed equality, or I'm not quite sure what the best word is, to our lives, uncomplicating them, not necessarily making it easy, but I do love that. And is there one or two of them that really kind of speak to you the most that you want to touch on?
Yeah, I think one we've already mentioned, which is forbearance and equanimity, kind of that calm, even-mindedness in difficult situations. But I think the other one is interdependence. It's a reliance on people, God, and nature, because we tend to be in a culture where relationships and interactions are transactional. I'll do something for you if you do something for me, or they are caregiving type of things of course I'll do this for you, but we have lost the humility and that need to be dependent upon others. We have become really so autonomous and independent, and I think the pandemic really furthered that along, that we tend to live in isolation rather than live in community with one another, whether it's our family, whether it's our church community, whether it's our neighborhood. How many of us live in neighborhoods but don't even know the person living next to us? So I think that is an important part. And then really, on any given day, a lot of them are important, but you mentioned fidelity. And I think one reason why I chose fidelity is because fidelity is not just this loyalty in marriage. Fidelity really is about a loyalty and commitment to a person or a cause. Okay. And in today's world, again, with transactional relationships, we have forgotten how to kind of be in the stands for other people, or how to really show up for the causes that we say are most important to us. We have forgotten how to show up for the people who are most important to us, because there's always something that is going to call our attention to say, well, I could do that, but I'm going to do this instead.
Yeah.
And in relationships, it really speaks loudly when you are there for another person. And I think just even looking at God's fidelity with us and our fidelity to God, we tend to have really shallow relationships with others, and fidelity helps us remember what God's parameters for relationships really are.
Yeah, and I did like how you pointed out it's not just within marriage. It is within communities and for causes, as you mentioned, because, yeah, that loyalty to and just showing up and being interdependent is not always seen these days. I know my children have mentioned their peers. You call them and they may or may not get in touch with you. And I've noticed that a lot, even amongst older, I would say my peer group in business. I've noticed that it's more common for to reach out, and I may or may not hear back ever.
Right. Even just the common courtesy to say, this isn't going to work for us, or this isn't a good fit for us. The ghosting is so common. And I think even just the fly-by-night causes that we think we're passionate about, right? It's easy to be on social media and share something and say, oh, this is important, but will we take the next step to volunteer for that organization, or to give financially to that organization, or do anything that is sacrifice to ourselves? And I think that's the component that so much of our culture is missing, that in past generations was still embedded in the culture. And I think that's why, living in an Amish community, that's a big tourist area. A lot of people come here because they see that type of commitment to one another in the Amish community. But again, I wrote the book so that these skills that people kind of want, they know that they're transferable to their own lives. So whatever it is that's your cause, because our causes will all be different. Our passions are all different. Our callings are all different. But being a person who follows through on those things is that element of fidelity that we're sadly missing in so many places.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned not all of us are going to be living on a farm in an Amish community. So how do we take some of these ideas? Because they can sound, oh, well, that's great. That's beautiful for you because you live there. What about somebody who's in the middle of the city? Or I live in a more suburban place, and I was so thankful to be able to get out and take walks during COVID versus like in a city and stuck in an apartment. But how do you take some of these and transfer them into our modern busy lives?
Yeah, luckily throughout the whole book, I do that. That's the one thing I do, is there's 2 sections in every chapter called Cultivating the Virtue, and then a lifestyle of that virtue. And it gives multiple examples no matter where you live. And then in each chapter, there are about 10 to 12 kind of takeaways of how you can do it yourself. And I really worked hard to get a wide breadth of activities and modeling of what that looks like, because even though I live on the farm, I work in a public school. I work in urban settings. I work in city settings, in the school settings where I've worked. So I work with families, and as a therapist too, I work with people across almost all socioeconomic groups. And what is a principle that's over here is always transferable to any lifestyle, no matter where you are, including milking a water buffalo. And I think that was one of the examples I gave.
Yes, it was.
It was. So when I was in India as a board member for a nonprofit, we visited one of the neighbors, and it was water buffalo milking time. And the owner kind of said, would anyone like to try? Well, I milk cows and goats back at home. So I raised my hand, and people did not expect it. Why? Because I was in my khakis. I was in my dress shirt. But milking an animal in Indiana is no different than milking an animal in India. So I squatted down on my haunches with my very well-dressed, well-educated self, and started milking this water buffalo. And it was an example to say that no matter what a biblical principle is, no matter what a human life principle is, they're all transferable across all cultures, across all locations, across all lifespans. life seasons. And that is really what is my heart behind Uncomplicated, is that people who come to my area to say, oh, I wish I had this dreamy life of living in Amish country. I'm here to say, you can have this less complicated but compelling life that you really want. Let's kind of revisit the ways to do that.
Yeah, and I did like a lot of the practical tips in there, and a lot of them I didn't notice were getting out and doing things with your hands, going out into nature, being grateful, and looking at things in a different perspective, getting in touch with people, really being intentional about those relationships. Those are some of the ones that come to my mind overall that I liked, and I went, okay. And there were some other things. There was the quilt that she made that I thought was beautiful. I actually had a quilt finished for my husband for Christmas that his grandmother had started, and I was like, I don't think I can finish it, but I can make sure it gets finished.
Right. Well, and I think that's just it, is that God has given all of us these very specific bents, skills, talents, passions in our own spheres of influence. Mm-hmm. And that's a common theme throughout the book, is that we each have our own spheres of influence.
Yes.
And the other part of that is also that for me, it might look this way. For you, it's going to look this way. You know, my kids all live in urban areas. None of them live on a farm. None of them are going to move back to the farm. I have a child who lives in Cincinnati, one in Oklahoma City, one near Indianapolis. So their lives are very different from how they were raised, but it's the taking with us. And I think that's the piece that each of us have, the things in our life that, we need to ask ourselves, what is most important? I think at the end of the day, Uncomplicated really is a values clarification book. It's kind of a discipleship book to say, you know what? Let's think about the sustainable principles that you want in your life. These are 10 that I have chosen that I think humanity, we just need to kind of revisit a little bit more, especially from a mental health and a better lifestyle perspective. But each of us have these priorities that we tend to live out because it's what's most pressing now. And we long for these values that may sometimes be in conflict with what we're actually living out. And so it's really just encouraging people to say, what are your core values that are sustainable over time? And then how do you take those and put them into this modern life? Because honestly, I think we give ourselves too much credit in our technological life to think that life can't be less complicated when it just really can.
It seems very difficult to kind of go against the grain of all the complication of life, and then how do you pull back and really institute some of these things and go and say no, because that means you do have to say no to some things, and we don't like to do that. We like to. I'm guilty of it. I'm like, I want to do everything. I mean, why do I have to choose? I want to do all of it. In which case, I'm going to run myself ragged. And you're like, no, I'm learning every now and again. Do you want to do something? And I'm like, that sounds like a lot of fun, but there's a lot going on. And I think as much as I might enjoy it, it would just end up being too much. So I'm going to say no. I'm going to miss that one.
Yeah. And I think that's really important because, you know, when we think of how much time we spend on social media, or when we think about all the things that we think we have to do now, we tend to get caught up into then being overwhelmed and not really do anything well. And one thing I just love about, I guess, the perspective that I have seen as a teacher and as someone who works in public schools is that there's always going to be a time for other things to come around. And what's most important is that, you know, life is just not a race. And at the end of the day, our life can be quickly changed in an instant.
Yes.
And I think that's another perspective that we have lost, is especially with AI, right? We tend to think, well, we just have this immortality, and that is antithetical to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so I think as we just spend a little bit of time with God, with ourselves, and I do mention nature a lot because that's the real world. The artificial world is very much part of our life now. Technology is, but God has designed us as humans to interact with our environment. And we have to especially be mindful of that as we are raising children, as we're raising grandchildren, because it really is how God designed us.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I know that there are times when I will definitely find a time to just, even if I'm reading a book, I can read inside or I can read outside. And if it's not raining or like so blistering hot or like crazy cold, I will choose to sit outside, even if it's just to read a book or go outside and do something. And it's very recharging. It's very renewing. And with all of this encouragement to do being uncomplicated, what would you say to encourage someone to pursue the passion that God has placed in their hearts?
That each of us has a circle of influence, and God has given us the opportunity to color in that circle of influence. Every single person, no matter what stage of your life, influences someone, just like you mentioned about that clerk at the grocery store. We need one another. And so whatever it is that God has called you to, even today, whether it's a conversation, whether it's an email that you're sending, whether it is just something that you're doing for your family, all of it is significant. And that a compelling life is not something really for other people. A compelling life is really what we live out in our day in and day out. That is the sustainable breath kind of that we take up in this world over time. And it is powerful. And I just want to let every listener know how important and how powerful our presence is in today's culture. And that when you do that thing that God has placed on your heart, when you interact with another person, when you color in your sphere of influence, it has more impact, I believe, in today's culture than ever before, because our culture is so hungry for authentic people and for the light of Christ. And we take the light of Christ as Christians. We take the light of Christ with us no matter what we do, even if it's just ordering at a drive-through. Yeah. The way that we interact with that person shines the light of Christ, and our culture desperately needs more of truly authentic people sharing the light of Christ.
I agree. And I love the image of coloring in our sphere of influence, because I'm very glad that adult coloring has come back. It is very calming and very soothing. So I really appreciate that. Well, Brenda, if someone wants to connect with you, they want to get your book, you've got a podcast and a Facebook group and a lot of different ways to connect with you and glean some more of your wisdom. What is the best way for them to connect with you?
They can connect with me at my website, BrendaYoder.com, and sign up for my newsletter. It comes out about once a month. They can also connect with me on Instagram at Brenda Yoder Speaker. I'm on Facebook at Brenda Yoder. No, I'm going to turn that around. Instagram is Brenda Yoder Speaks. Instagram is Brenda Yoder Speaker. I do have a Life Beyond the Picket Fence podcast and a Midlife Moms podcast and Facebook group if you're a midlife mom. You can get my book, Uncomplicated. I also write devotionals for Mornings with Jesus with guideposts.
Okay, very good. Well, we'll encourage people to check that out, get connected with you, and definitely I would encourage them to read Uncomplicated. It's a wonderful read, and to just sit and savor it, read it over, read it, and then a couple months later, read it again and remind it. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your spending the time with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for joining me today on A Woman's Heart. I'm Lisa Granger. Didn't you just love Brenda? I trust that you took away some nuggets from our conversation to live a simpler, more fulfilling life. I encourage you to get her book, Uncomplicated: Secret Skills for a Compelling Life, from her or wherever books are sold. The link to Brenda's website is in the show notes, along with my website, lisagranger.com, where you can find more about me, the show, and the complete summer reading list. Make sure you follow on your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss an episode, and tell a friend. This is how most people find out about a podcast. Have a blessed day.